The CBC is very different. If you're the Toronto Star or CTV News or any private entity, Global News, and you want to publish something that maybe isn't true, or you want to take the position of a pharmaceutical company, you can do that. If you want to trick your viewers into believing something that isn't true, there's really nothing to stop them from doing that. However, the CBC is a public entity. We pay for it. It broadcasts on the public airwaves, and we expect them to tell us the truth because they've done it for 50 or 60 years. So what I started noticing was something very different. About a week, maybe two at the most, into the emergency, there was a story on The National by Adrian Arsenault, one of the greatest broadcasters we have, a national treasure. Adrian has a particular ability to appear to be discovering the facts in the moment.
So what do you do when this happens? A loved one, let's say it's your dad, drops into the family group chat with something he thinks is real. It's something about China manufacturing the coronavirus. There's a link to a site you've never heard of with a message calling it scary stuff. So what do you do with this? Do you ignore it? Do you call him out saying how ridiculous you think this is?
If you do that to your dad, you've actually shamed him. My name is Claire Wardle and I'm the US Director of First Draft. And we are a non-profit that we help people navigate the challenges of misinformation online. What happens is that your dad doubles down on his view and he dismisses what you're saying. Use language that's empathetic and to say we're all in this together, and rather than you're wrong, I'm right, here are the facts, because that does not work.
So hold back on all that reactive talk. Maybe try something like this. Yeah, these are scary times. We're all a bit afraid, but let's be careful. What you're sharing is inaccurate and it feeds into that fear we all feel.
Everybody's anxiety is so heightened right now. People are sharing this stuff not for any malicious reasons, but because they're scared too.
Sending more context could also be a good move, but don't drown them in evidence. Maybe send an article from a legitimate source quoting credible scientists on why the virus wasn't manufactured. Conspiracies can be just as infectious, just as dangerous as a virus, so you have to guard against them.
It's very easy to just mute your crazy high school friend on Facebook or to leave a WhatsApp group where people are sharing false information. But right now, I actually think there's kind of a responsibility on all of us to help people understand that sharing that kind of information is increasing the level of pollution.
Even if it's take 20, she can do it every time. She's a genius at what she does. But she turned this ability against us. I saw a piece on the 4th of April where she opens up and she's looking at her phone and she says, what do you do if this happens? Somebody sends you a family text, say it's your father, and he thinks that the virus was manufactured by China. This is on April 4th, 2020. It says 2023 on the slide. That's incorrect. It was 2020. And I thought, well, wait a minute. How do you know it wasn't manufactured in a lab in China? What evidence does the CBC have 20 days into this or 15 days into this that this was not manufactured in a lab? There was an assumption that she put forth instantly, and then she went to an expert guest who said, well, don't embarrass your father, you'll just push him away. You've got to bring him in and you got to kind of convince him. And I thought, well, I'm a father. Who are you speaking to? You're telling my children not to believe their father. You're telling, and I have some expertise and some experience in this particular field. And I thought it was shocking that the CBC was trying to get in between me and my children. And the expert witness was from an organization called First Draft, and she simply says, I'm from First Draft. We're a nonprofit that helps people navigate misinformation on the media. And I think of nonprofits, I think of the Cancer Society, the Diabetes Society. I don't think of a group of people who are attempting to change the minds of strangers from believing things that they don't want them to believe. I thought that was all very odd. So I looked into First Draft, and I saw that this organization was developed and is developing new techniques and methodologies for investigating online spaces. Our latest approach revolves around the concept of recipes. As with food recipes, says their website, these steps give directions to investigators or to reporters. So they give samples of what you can do. They say, here's an investigation. How anti-vaccination websites build audiences and monetize information. This is 2 weeks into the emergency. Here's the recipe. How are these anti-vaccination websites funded? Investigate the ad trackers with GEFI and DMI tracker tool. Now, these are tools that they provide to apparently the CBC. Now, there was a story that circulated later about anti-vaccination websites on Marketplace and how they make their money. So this First Draft group is now feeding the CBC their stories. A second example, pro-Russian networks are driving anti-Pfizer vaccine disinformation. Now, I don't know why the CBC has to get behind Pfizer, which has paid out the largest criminal settlement in the history of American justice, but this is what this organization is saying: don't be against Pfizer. The Russians are behind it. The recipe was track misinformation across platforms such as 4chan, 8kun, and Reddit. So they're even telling them how to go after them, where to go after them. They're directing the CBC. I was astonished that this organization was put forth as an expert on how to not believe your father, but not embarrass him at the same time. So this, to me, had nothing to do with news gathering. 10 days later, after the CBC did that story, the Washington Post did some real journalism. They pointed out that the State Department cables were sent from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to Washington in 2018, warning about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it was unhygienic. And in particular, they said there was a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This was January 2018. And there was 2 cables sent, and the reporter saw one of them. The first cable, which I obtained, he says, this is Josh Rogan from the Washington Post, warns that the lab's work on bat coronaviruses and their potential human transmission represented a risk of a new SARS-like pandemic. So not only at the moment when Adrian Arsenault was telling you don't believe your father if he thinks it came from a lab, it was not only probable that COVID came from the lab, but it had been predicted that it would happen 2 years prior by the US government. So how does Adrian Arsenault say it wasn't? And don't believe anyone, including your family. Flash forward a year, Vanity Fair magazine, which is known for its excellent investigative reporting, published an extremely long and exhaustive piece where all they did was go online and look at publicly available scientific papers going back about a decade. The first one in 2013 was by Shi Zhengli, who's the director of emerging infectious disease at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She's known as the Bat Lady, and this is not a derogatory term. Actually, her scientist friends started calling her that because there was an outbreak of a SARS-like respiratory virus in a mine, and the miners died very, very quickly. And she is documented to having gone to that mine, scraped the bat guano off the mine, and brought it to Wuhan to examine. In 2014, she began publishing about the coronavirus from Chinese bats. In 2015, there was another paper that Vanity Fair found where Shi Zhengli discussed successfully inserting a protein from this Chinese horseshoe bat virus into the SARS virus of 2002, creating a brand new infectious pathogen. 2015, this scientific paper was published. Vanity Fair found it online. CBC could have found it, but they were too busy telling you don't trust anyone who believes this. In 2019, there was a paper actually published by one of the lab directors at Wuhan outlining the safety deficiencies in the Wuhan lab where he worked. And in 2019, right around the time that the US government, the US Embassy in Beijing was warning Washington about a potential SARS-like pandemic leaking out of this unhygienic lab, a number of the Wuhan lab scientists published a paper together describing genetically engineered rats that they had grown with humanized lungs and developed them in the Wuhan lab. So this is a pretty hot smoking gun coming out of the Wuhan lab. There are 3 labs in the world working on coronavirus, according to the Vanity Fair investigation. 2 of them are in the United States, 1 of them's in Wuhan. If this thing started at a wet market outside the Wuhan lab, it was because one of the staff members of the Wuhan lab walked into the wet market and brought it there. That is the most likely scenario. Now flash forward to this month, March 2023. US FBI Chief Christopher Wray says the China lab leak was most likely. The quote is, The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident. So the CBC had no evidence that it wasn't. They wanted you to believe that it wasn't. There's a definition of news gathering, and you'll see, interestingly, that news gathering is one word in the English language. It's not two words as it appears that it should be. And that's because it's very specific. It's the process of doing research on news items, especially ones that will be broadcast on television or printed in a newspaper. Now, how much research was done by the CBC to determine 10 days after the emergency that it didn't happen in a lab? Another definition here is propaganda. Persuasive mass communication that filters and frames the issues of the day in a way that strongly favors particular interests, usually those of a government or a corporation. Also, the intentional manipulation of public opinion through lies and half-truths and the selective retelling of history. This is what was going on in that piece. That's why it felt so wrong to me, because there was no news involved. There was only propaganda. What the Washington Post did with its lab leak theory story 10 days after the CBC said it wasn't from the lab was news gathering. It was investigative reporting. What the CBC did when it said don't trust your family if they think it came from a lab, that's propaganda. That's the difference in the definition of those two things. The Vanity Fair piece, reviewing scientific publications for a decade and uncovering the fact that human lungs were engineered on rats in Wuhan lab in 2019, just before the outbreak, is news gathering. Exceptional news gathering. I'm jealous of how good that news gathering was. What the BBC did, reporting on the FBI, saying they've known for a long time that it came from the lab, was news gathering. That's kind of news of the day, daily news. They said it, we're telling you they said it. What the CBC did by warning Canadians not to trust their fathers about a lab leak theory was propaganda. March 4th, 2021, about a year after the emergency, the editor-in-chief of CBC News, Brodie Fenlon, wrote on his blog, a recent survey found that about half of Canadians think journalists are purposely trying to mislead them. Well, that's because we're on to you. At least half of us pay attention to our gut, and we know that you are purposely trying to mislead us. But Mr. Fenlon said that CBC is going to correct this. To promote trust in journalism, the CBC has joined 4 organizations. I didn't know that they joined these organizations until I began to look into this a little bit. One of them is called the Trusted News Initiative, which is designed to filter news through its own trust filter system. Another one's called the Journalism Trust Initiative. It's basically the same name, but this one does more or less the same thing. Another one's called the Trust Project, and then Project Origin. And notice that none of these organizations have the word truth in them. If you tell the truth consistently, trust is automatic. If you don't tell the truth consistently, you have to say things like, please trust me. So I'm just going to quickly outline what these things are, because they're all basically the same thing. The Trusted News Initiative and the CBC announced together on the 27th, prior to the Adrian Arsenault piece, that CBC and Radio Canada are joining an industry collaboration of major media and technology organizations to rapidly identify and stop the spread of harmful coronavirus disinformation. I think the pandemic really started in China about 4 months prior to this, and 4 months prior to an unknown virus killing so many people, there is no disinformation. The scientists among our commissioners will tell you there is only information, and all information is critical at the beginning, particularly at the beginning. So immediately they were in a position of pushing one side of the story. Stopping misinformation means censorship, pure and simple. The Journalism Trust Initiative, a second organization that they joined, is run by an outfit called Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders. And when I was working as a correspondent in the Middle East, the Reporters Without Borders would take the side of, say, a Syrian journalist who was writing something against the dictator Hafez al-Assad and maybe had been imprisoned, and they were trying to bring attention of the world to this imprisoned journalist. That's the kind of excellent work this group did. In 2020, it shifted completely to start something called the Journalism Trust Initiative, starting an algorithmic indexing based on their criteria to improve your revenues, meaning if you run your news organization through their filter, they'll make sure that it gets up to the top of the Google page, so you'll get more clicks and more money will improve your revenue. There was an incentive there. Project Origin is another one that is, it's a collaboration between the CBC, the BBC, the New York Times, and Microsoft. And one of these organizations is not a news organization, it's a tech organization. One of the things they talk about here is that the technical provenance approach, in conjunction with media education and synthetic media detection techniques, to help establish a foundation of trust. Not truth, trust is what they're looking for. One of their tools is called the power of the machine, harnessing AI to fight disinformation. So I can only surmise from this that Microsoft is using AI to identify anybody speaking words that they want to identify as to be censored or call misinformation, label misinformation, so you will agree with their censorship. The next one is called the Trust Project. Now this one is largely tech. Craigslist, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft are involved. Again, helping tech support trustworthy news, helping tech. What do we care about tech and truth and news? How are they together all of a sudden? We stand for integrity. They say, look for our 8 trust indicators. We built the trust indicators. So they have listed, all they have to do is tell the truth. They don't need no 8 trust indicators. And interestingly, Google, Facebook, and Bing all use the trust indicators in display and behind the scenes. So somehow they are censoring it before it gets to you. I'm going the wrong way. These are the members of the Trust Project. Now, this goes way beyond the CBC. Globe and Mail is also in there. CTV is a member. The Walrus magazine in Canada is supposed to be an independent thought magazine. They're part of this project. The Canadian Press. So I put this up there to let you know that it is not just the CBC. The reason they all sound the same is because they're all part of this trust campaign. But the CBC is also part of something else. It's something with just public broadcasters. It's called the Global Task Force for Public Media. Global Task Force exists to defend the values and interests of public media. Excellent. But it was formed to develop a consensus and a single strong voice among them. And that's the CBC, BBC News, ABC Australia, Korean Broadcasting, they joined recently, France Television, Radio New Zealand, ZDF from Germany, and SVT from Sweden. Now, I can't imagine, having worked at the CBC for almost a decade and being told every day our job is to elevate the voices of Canadians on Canadian stories, to unite our vast country and make us all feel as one. What single issue do we have with Korean broadcasting when that is our mandate? What issue does Radio New Zealand have with Swedish television when their mandate is the same, to elevate their own people? This is a bizarre conglomerate of public broadcasters, and I would put forth to the panel that the public broadcasters are the ones that are not easily bought because the advertisers don't exist and therefore they have no influence. So something else was done here. Now, the Public Task Force is headed by our CBC president, Catherine Tate. She is the current president. 3 months ago, she gave a speech at Simon Fraser University. The first word out of her mouth was trust. Trust seems to be in short supply. The next phrase is disinformation, conspiracy theories, U2 rabbit hole. This is the Trusted News Initiative mantra. This is what she was talking about at Simon Fraser University. She goes around, makes speeches, and says, please trust us. So let's get to what they do. In addition to the first piece that I saw in the National that rubbed me the wrong way, I listened to a piece one day in my car by Matt Galloway, again, a national treasure. I love this guy. When I first heard him on CBC Toronto, I thought, oh my God, there's a future. He might be the next Zosky. And then he turned on us. He did a story on March 29th, 2021, where he interviewed a guy from something called the Center for Countering Digital Hate. And I thought this was going to be about anti-Semitism or something, digital hate. Instead, the guy said, people who are recommending vitamin C intravenous and hydrogen peroxide nebulization are hate. And I thought, well, how is recommending health treatments. I mean, vitamin C intravenous has been going on for 50 years. It's used in cancer treatment. It's used in all kinds of treatment. Hydrogen peroxide nebulization is a simple drugstore hydrogen peroxide 3% mixed with water and vaporized into a mask so you clean out your nasal passage and stop viral replication, and it's common. You can buy them. So how are these things dangerous? How are they hateful? It was particularly interesting to me. But the expert guest went on to say that these people will kill. And he said that the hydrogen peroxide nebulizers, which are benign, are literally inhaling bleach. This is his words, literally inhaling bleach. It's actually not. It's actually literally a hydrogen peroxide nebulizer. It's literally nebulizing hydrogen peroxide. It's not literally inhaling bleach. Inhaling bleach is literally inhaling bleach. He lied. So why is he lying to Matt Galloway? Why is Matt Galloway letting him lie to me on the radio? And I know it's a lie for a fact. The same guy from the Center for Countering Digital Hate, who also went on to say anti-vaccine misinformation is hate, which I believe diminishes the power of that word for all those who have experienced it. He went on Marketplace to say this, but then Marketplace took it to the next level. They became a censor. Marketplace reported 800 pieces of information to social media giants, attempting to have them censored, claiming they were misinformation. And then they complained that the media giants only took down 12% of what CBC said was wrong on the internet. So my questions are, since when is the CBC deciding what misinformation on other media platforms is? What is it their business? They're the CBC. Do your job. Pay attention to yourself. Why are you going out correcting, in your view, what's wrong with other media? How is the CBC or Marketplace or this reporter qualified to comb the internet for 800 posts and declare them to be false? We never found out in the piece. And who at the CBC is the arbiter of truth and misinformation on the behalf of us Canadians who like to decide for ourselves? So I wrote a letter to the head of journalistic standards at CBC, Paul Hambleton, who has since left the position. I asked him to do 3 things for me, please. I told him who I was and that I'd worked there, and I named some people that we would know in common. And I said, please supply me with the policy at the CBC that describes the mandate to correct what you deem to be misinformation by other organizations. Please include the process by which information is deemed to be incorrect and therefore requires correction or censorship by the CBC. And I asked to please supply me with any other example outside of the COVID-19 story where CBC corrects what it deems to be misinformation on social media. Now, he did reply to me, but he didn't answer any of those questions.